In 1961, the U.S. sent anti-Cuban exiles to Cuba in a CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Castro's rule of power. This mission was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was unsuccessful at removing Castro from power. Instead, the incident only increased tension between U.S. and Cuba, further pushing Cuba towards the Soviet Union and communism. It can also be said that the tension increased because this situation would lead to the development of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You came down to this southern town last summer to show the folks a brand new way of life. But all you've shown the folks around here is trouble, and you've only added misery to their strife. Your concern is
In 1962, an American U-2 spy plane secretly photographed nuclear missiles that were being built on Cuba by the Soviet Union, aiming towards the United States. This issue was debated in the United Nations General Assembly, with Stevenson as the U.S. delegate and Zoran as the Soviet ambassador. The Soviet Union had at first denied the existence of the missiles until confronted with photo evidence from the United States.
you bring a lot of trouble to a town and then you leave. That's part of your communistic game.
Speaking of issues, it has come to my knowledge that dangerous threatening weapons are being built by the Soviet Union and Cuba. These nuclear weapons threaten not only the US, but the national peace and security of our entire planet.
What are you talking about? We haven't placed any missiles in Cuba.
Well, if you haven't been placing missiles in Cuba, then what is this? Good evening, my fellow citizens. The government has maintained close surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on Cuba. Within the past few weeks, we have gained unmistakable evidence that establishes the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on the island. Therefore, to halt this buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. Thank you and good night.
Street, protesting those who want to fight for freedom, my friend. This kind of leader makes our country weak. Now ain't I right? Ain't you right? Ain't you right? Let's look and find the strong and able leaders. It's time we found
Good
just
evening, my
how
fellow
they would
citizens.
stand. If we're
Eventually, a conclusion was reached, with the U.S. initiating a naval quarantine around Cuba and Khrushchev agreeing to instruct Soviet ships already sailing towards Cuba to stay away for a limited time. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy would formally announce the naval quarantine on national television, while also demanding the Soviets to remove their missiles from Cuba. This decision was made with careful consideration and negotiation. Originally, Kennedy's cabinet was extremely alarmed by the situation, and there were many calls for President Kennedy to launch a nuclear attack on Cuba, but he firmly rejected these ideas. It was later discovered that the missiles were fully operational in Cuba, and the Soviets were given the okay to fire if fired upon. So this was a crucial decision by Kennedy to make a naval quarantine rather than ordering the Air Force to start fighting.
I demand for your nuclear weapons to be removed from Cuba as it poses a threat not only to the US, but to the security of our entire planet. I call upon you to help rebuild stability and peaceful relations between our two countries.
my missiles are purely for defensive reasons, as I always knew the US would try and invade Cuba at some point. I need to demonstrate to the world that the Soviets can compete with the US at a nuclear level and stop this possible invasion at the same time. How can you call our missiles in Cuba offensive when you place missiles in Turkey with their supposed right to demand security for your own country?
After the missiles were discovered, the following 13 days were filled with tension and anxiety as the two nations teetered on the edge of nuclear warfare. A U.S. pilot was shot down in Cuba, Soviet submarines had moved menacingly towards the quarantine, and other incidents continued to further tensions. Communication was extremely bad between the two nations as they mainly relied on communication through letters. Khrushchev would send letters to Kennedy indicating the peaceful intentions of the Soviet Union. Kennedy's responses would mainly consist of asking Khrushchev to remove the dangerous missiles as they posed a direct threat to world peace and stable relations between the two nations. Both, however, were trying to prevent a war from breaking out. Eventually, on October 28th, after around 2 days of negotiating a result to the crisis, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba and ending the naval quarantine. Later on, the U.S. will also remove missiles in Turkey, which the Soviet Union had mentioned in a previous letter.
You used to call me on my... You used to. Yeah. You used to call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need my love. Call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need my love. And I know when...
After the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, the two nations will establish a hotline from Moscow to Washington. The purpose of the hotline was to ensure that quick telecommunication would be achieved between the two nations for any future emergency crises that may occur. The Cuban Missile Crisis almost led to a dangerous nuclear war, and thus increased the importance of communication between the two nations. The US and the USSR will also pass a nuclear test ban treaty in 1963 that bans all above-ground testing of nuclear weapons for the sake of the environment, a compromise that was able to be completed because of their resolvements in this crisis.
Used to call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need my love. Call me on my cell phone. Late night when you need